Recently, we painted up some Khorne Berserkers, and I think it would be a good idea to paint up a test model using a tetrad palette and the scale 75 paints. In this tetrad palette, we have obviously a few colours. We've got a yellow tone, as well as a purple, a red, and a green tone. On top of that, we've also got two modifiers. We've got a white tone as well as a black, which we can use to adjust the saturation a little bit as well. Kicking off the painting, we can start with the red armour panels. But we're not going to be coming in with a pure red on top of the Zenithal Prime. Instead, we are going to be mixing a little bit of purple into our red until we have a darker red to work from. And we're going to be using this as a base and recess colour. With that applied, we can start highlighting the red armour by, as you would expect, adding in some red into our previous mix, slowly progressing through a couple of layers and a couple of different mixes until we are eventually layering on essentially pure thinned red. This pure red layer will be applied in a thin panel highlight. In this case, we are applying it in a semi-volumetric, but still giving it an overall readable sense across the entire model. We are going to be finishing off the reds by mixing our red in with a small amount of our yellow tone. Not enough to move this new colour into orange, but just enough to slightly lighten and brighten that hue. Then we can use this to apply a very thin edge and spot highlight across all the red armour panels. When mixing up the red for our base coat colours, I was kind of aiming for a dark brownish red, the sort of tone that you get from leftover dried blood. One, I think that's quite thematic for the overall Berserkers that we're painting up, as well as I think it works really well with the models, allowing us to have nice shadowy recesses, and then we can just add that red to the mix, brightening it up and bringing it to however bright or dark we want the overall red armour. Now we need to go on to the trim, but you'll obviously notice from the paints that we're using, we don't have any metallic. So what we're going to need to do is make up some mixes from our available colours in order to paint some non-metallic metals. We will start off by subscribing and then making a dark brownish mix, which we can do by taking our red and green and mixing them together using a touch of black just to bring down the brightness if desired. Then we can use this mix to base coat all of the trim areas, being careful to avoid all of the red armour panels which we have just painted. We could also use this mix for things like the pouches, leathers and some of the other areas, but we're actually going to be swapping that out a little bit later on for a different colour and just using this on the trim, which will hopefully give it a little bit of separation from the other areas. But if you wanted, you could take this same mix and then just highlight it in a different path and you'd get a little bit of variety, but we'll touch on that a little bit later on. With our base coat down, we can continue the metals by taking our yellow hue and then adding this to the last mix and applying a thin overcoat across near enough all of the non-recessed areas of the trim. We then need to move and add in a little bit more yellow, moving in a slightly harsher jump this time than we did with the red panels. We're going to be adding the yellow and start to broadly highlight all of the metals, taking care to focus on the placement of where the light would hit them and then bounce off and reflect based on the material that they are. Having now warmed up the overall tone using that yellow, we can mix a little bit of white into the previous mix and then use this as a thin edge highlight on all of the brightest surfaces, before we then take some pure white and come in to apply a very, very careful array of spot highlights in the center of any of the bright spots of trim. With the trim and the red armor done, we are now able to move on to all of the other elements, and we were able to base coat all of these in the same mix and then create a little bit of difference by adding different highlight colors and paths as we grew out. This is going to be things like the holsters, the leathers, the chains, and all of that sort of thing. And we're going to be starting off by mixing up a combination of our black and a purple. The fabrics and the leathers, once base coated in our black to purple mix, can be highlighted by mixing a little bit of our yellow into the black base coat mix, giving us an almost dark brown tone that works really well on these areas. And as with the rest of the model, as you can expect, we're going to be slowly adding a little bit more yellow as we progress through the various highlight layers. Then we have things like the grenade, lenses, and weapon shell and weapon casings. What we're going to be doing here is moving to the green section in our tetrad, mixing black, purple and green, and then adding more green as we go through. We can make some small triangle sections across the model. Here we're aiming for the gun, parts of the axe, as well as the grenade, which gives us a nice triangle of section, which is then framing the face and eye lenses very nicely. Then what we need to do is finish up on all of the colder metals that are the things like the chains that are dangling across the model. And this can be done by taking the same black purple mix as we used to base all of these areas, and then we can come in and start to mix in a little bit of white, meaning that we end up in a mid-tone being a light greyish pink, and we can quickly go around and use this across all of the metal areas before we then come back using pure white to spot highlight all of the metals, similar to how we did on the trim. Then, if we have the model in sub-assemblies, all we need to do is reassemble the model, and we have a nicely painted Berserker. As I said, we used a limited palette. We used a tetrad palette of scale 75 paints to paint up this model. And I do like how it came out, but these paints are very, very matte compared to some of the other ranges which I use, which tend to be more satin. And that has a nice aesthetic, and I do like it. And I think that working with matte paints may actually overall improve my blending because they show off poor blends a little bit more, in my opinion. But I do like the aesthetic that it comes out with. What I am tempted to do is possibly paint up a couple more Berserkers in essentially the same scheme, but using different ranges. And then what we can do is compare the difference between, say, Games Workshop or Vallejo or whatever. Obviously, we do have a few different paint ranges available here at the channel, and I could grab a couple of different ones and potentially pick up a few extras if needed. So if you're interested in seeing a comparison between this scale 75 painted Berserker and potentially a few different paint ranged versions, do let me know down in the comments below, because I would be really interested to know. And obviously, do let me know what paint ranges you would like me to use as well, because that would be incredibly helpful. Otherwise, if you're interested in chaos a bit like this guy, why not check out this playlist where we go over a bunch of chaos sorts of things. Otherwise, you'll need to remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.